All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Randy Harrington, and you probably remember my daughter, Chelsea. She's the behavioral therapist.
A social worker who works as a therapist. My specialty for a long time was working with first episode psychosis.
Now, the last video where I had her on here, we talked about trauma and how that relates to people who have Bigfoot encounters or perceived encounters and the trauma that comes along with that. But now we're going to talk about a specific part of a possible Bigfoot encounter and the trauma that comes with that. I was speaking with her mother the other day about the incident that any of my followers are already aware of the story where they were out with me. But my wife, Julie, said that she has trouble remembering it. If it wasn't for us telling her what she did, she has blocked it out. And therein lies a part of this subject that the body will shut things out. And whether people say it to be in the in crowd or they say it for effect, I don't know, but the catchphrase these days are lost time. They like to say, well, I lost time. So they want to enter UFOs are involved and paranormal.
That's what I was going to say, like the supernatural.
because I lost time. Mm-hmm. But really, that's just a crazy answer for your body blocked out that section of trauma. Mm-hmm. And so there is a natural answer, an answer in the brain that what people are calling lost time is actually a real thing. And mm-hmm. Chelsea did some studying this past couple weeks on that subject, and it actually, the producer Alex was asking me to ask her specifically about this because he and I had this discussion. So she's looked up a lot of stuff this week on this subject, and I'll let her have the floor.
Well, so for about a year, I also worked for Topeka School District and did a lot of work around children who've experienced trauma. And certainly anyone who is experiencing a first episode psychosis, it's typically due to the onset of schizophrenia. And schizophrenia doesn't occur without the onset of trauma as well. And so this is something, the topic of trauma is something I've looked at and studied in many ways, and then I've experienced my own trauma. And so I've gone through EMDR, the eye movement desensitization retraining, which is a specific type of therapy for a traumatic experience. And that was after I was attacked by one of the clients that I worked with. And there are many ways that we create memories. There's episodic memories, there's semantic memory, there's procedural memory, there's emotional memory. So there's not just like one part of our brain where memory is housed. It happens all over, but there are different ways that memories can be encoded. So when we enter an anxious state or our fight, flight, freeze, that safety response, the front part of our brain, the middle part of our brain goes offline. It shuts down. So we are operating out of our brainstem, and that's survival mode. So that's where it's a lot of our automatic reflexes. That is where survival happens. So if we're functioning out of survival, we're not creating memories. We're not making the connections that need to happen. And that's because there are all these physiological responses that happen when we enter our safety part of the brain. So cortisol is elevated, adrenaline, epinephrine, all of that gets released in our body, and that can shut down the pathways that are needed for memories to be created. So you can, when you experience a trauma, you may not have memory, but there's also where we can have denial. So later on, we can deny our own memories and essentially erase it from our brain. There's dissociative amnesia, which can occur for some people where they'll dissociate and not have memories of what they're doing when they're doing it. So there are so many different things that can happen. But I think a lot about how we can help increase people's ability to remember things that when they do have an experience like that. So something that can be really helpful is Tetris. So playing Tetris, having a game of Tetris on your phone. So this could be helpful for anyone who's going out with you. Even if you've had an experience, if you're experiencing it again and it was traumatic the first time, it could be re-traumatizing. So then you may not remember certain parts of it. But
So
playing,
what does Tetris do? Does it
Right.
allow you to concentrate on something else?
So what happens is when we experience something traumatic, a lot of times we will replay. It's that visual imagery that we will then sit and replay in our head, and that is called memory consolidation. And that's where we encode it as feeling traumatic because our body is still, heart rate's beating, all of these physiological responses have still occurred, and now we're replaying it in our mind, and then we encode it as traumatic. If within like 6 hours and even up to a week after experiencing something traumatic, if you play Tetris requires imagination and visual processing that you can't do that and replay something in your mind at the same time. So it allows your body to essentially relax, and then you're not replaying it in your mind and encoding it as trauma. So later on, then you can still recall it, but you're not having the physiological response, so it's not as traumatic.
Wow. Well, I was, prior to our conversation here, I was thinking about different aspects of this subject. And from an evolutionary standpoint, it's a necessity because if we didn't have this encoded into our brain to happen, then you would relive every vehicle accident you were in. You would remember the pain and the agony and the bone breaking and all those things. The way things are now, those things can be shut out, and you don't have to remember them in detail, which would bring you extreme pain and of the memory of even a physical trauma accident. So most people after a traumatic accident, they're like, I don't remember anything until I woke up and there was the EMT. Because if you could remember everything, it would be extremely uncomfortable if you couldn't shut that out.
Absolutely. But then on the flip side, it's also an evolutionary something that we do remember those traumatic experiences. And so that's where you get the folks who ruminate and replay it. And that's evolutionary because for survival, we have to remember when we went out on this trail and a snake bit us to not go back out on that trail so we don't get bit by another snake. So we have to remember these things, but then our brain can go into overdrive depending on your mental state when it occurred, depending on who you were with, if you were with supportive people. So that kind of lends to the conversation we had where if you experience something and then you go try to tell somebody about it and they're like, no, that's not true. That didn't happen. You didn't experience it that way, and they deny your reality, then that creates more trauma for somebody. So if you're with people who are supportive and you're able to share your story, and they may not believe you, but if they still validate your experience, you may not experience it as trauma. So there's a lot of things like that. And then what's helpful too is forward eye movement. So after experiencing something traumatic, this is the reason why EMDR works, because it's about how you move your eyes. It's not necessarily the side to side, the bilateral body stuff, but it's your eyes moving. Because from an evolutionary standpoint, if we're moving forward, we're probably safe. If we are approaching, we're probably safe. So it's when we retreat, our eyes don't move side to side when we retreat, but when we move forward, our eyes move side to side. And that sends physiological signals to our body to relax and to calm. And so even after experiencing something that sends out that cortisol and adrenaline, walking or looking side to side. So this is kind of like reorienting to your space and bringing yourself back down can help relieve some of those traumatic body sensations.
Yeah, it's crazy. When you talk about however long it takes to get to that point where you can bring yourself back down for us and for Julie. And I'm just using Julie, even though you and Ashley experienced it in your own way, it wasn't as extreme as Julie. Julie is complete, no fight or flight. It's just all flight when it comes to her and panic.
Right.
But there was a moment when we got back to the cabin with the porch light on that we're sitting on the front porch of that cabin, looking out at the woods and the mountains and in the darkness, and even in the comfort under that light, in the safety of that cabin front porch. Julie was like, well, maybe we could have stayed a little bit longer and see how it turned out.
Right.
But that's
and that's called the hot cold empathy gap. So that the same thing happens like when you exercise, and let's say you're like running up this really steep hill, and it's like your legs are on fire and your lungs, like it all just hurts. You're like halfway bent over because the hill is so steep, and you get to the top of the hill and you're like, oh, and you're like, I could do it again. But no, but it's because our brain, that it's just this weird wiring that we have, and I mean it's amazing, but no, we could not have stayed out there longer. But there's also, I mean, when we think about memory and all of these things that are put off in our body, the ability to remain calm and emotionally regulate yourself in those moments is so helpful. So for somebody like you, and I don't know how open you've been in all of these and kind of talking about your upbringing, but having that hypervigilance and having that history where you had to learn pretty early to pay attention and to regulate yourself. So that has probably served you well then in these situations, because you're familiar with that feeling.
It's funny that you bring that up, because I was discussing with Alex when we were texting back and forth, and he was talking about me and Shane having kind of like a different demeanor when it comes to being able to calm yourself down, and I kept thinking back to the fire service, but at the fire service, I never needed any critical stress debriefing. And we were involved in some pretty traumatic stuff, where you see some really bad stuff and things like that, but it never bothered me. I didn't need to talk to anybody about it. Right. So it's almost like the fire service didn't make me that way. I was already that way.
Right. Which is also, and I think a lot about myself going into doing the crisis work and working with young adults who are psychotic, and I was with them alone in their home and seeing just the most bizarre behaviors and places that your mind can go when you've experienced lots of trauma and substance use, and your brain kind of just cracks. And I also never felt worried. I never felt scared. And I didn't require the first responder training, that so many folks go through, because I already felt like that.
You may have picked up some of that from me, even, I don't know, maybe genetically.
It's absolutely genetic.
Where my mind works so fast that I see, even driving down the road, I see every probable possibility of somebody pulling out, merging, doing something they're not supposed to do, and I'm aware of almost all of it to be able to avoid something that does happen when it does happen, because I stay 3 steps ahead, and I see 3 different outcomes, and which one is the right one to choose, because I see the outcome already of the other 2 choices.
So that is ultimate prefrontal cortex working. It's the if this, then that sort of thought. So when you are in your prefrontal cortex, you're able to set goals, you're able to problem solve, you're able to work through any sort of hypothetical. So the thing is, when you think about like being a firefighter, so first responders, it doesn't really count for us, but the emotional brain for a typical person who has not been a first responder, the emotional brain will win every time. So there's no logic that says you should run into a burning building. Logic says you should not do that. But if there's somebody you love in there, you'll do it. You will do it, because emotion, thought, logic happens up here, and this shuts down, and then emotion takes over. And then when emotion shuts down, it's because safety has taken over. So all of this will go offline. And this is how our brain develops. This is our brain stem, our safety, our autonomic nervous system. This is the first part of the brain to develop in utero, basic functions. And it's not until we're 30 years old that our prefrontal cortex is fully developed. So that's a lot of times why, and I even think about myself, it was around hitting age 30 that it was like this huge mental shift of feeling like, what am I doing with my life? I need to stop taking these risks. I need a retirement plan. Like all of these other things started to come into play. But I wanted to go back and touch on the genetic component. So there's a strong correlation between fathers. The study was pretty interesting, but actually fathers who have experienced abuse in childhood will pass your DNA changes, your genetics change because of those environmental things that occur, because you have elevated cortisol constantly. All of these things happen. So then that passes on through your sperm, and so I have been encoded with that DNA from your trauma. So I wasn't traumatized, but I've got the DNA, which this is how epigenetics works. I mean, so somebody who is a smoker, their offspring who may never smoke could have a DNA genetic component to develop lung cancer because their parents smoked. And that changed their gene expression and was then passed on. So all of this trauma absolutely it changes our body and then is passed on through generations. So my ability to tolerate stress is different than somebody whose father didn't experience trauma.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, I mean, some of my closest friends in the Bigfoot world is aware of my upbringing. Most of you listeners are not, but needless to say, I didn't have a very good father. And so anyway, I dragged that stuff along with me. Cynthia, the other producer, she even suggested that maybe I've spent my time developing a support system in the Bigfoot world of people that just give me support that I need.
Mm-hmm.
But I think everybody in the Bigfoot world who's experienced trauma in the Bigfoot world seeks the support of everybody. That's why you see the same people I've seen for 20 years that are still there, because they've seen something, they're troubled by it, and the only way you can get comfort is to hang out with other people who let you talk about it, and they also talk about it, and so it's kind of a weird little clique where we're all buddies, but we're all trying to get our therapy in.
Mm-hmm. And that there is something, it's so therapeutic to have that peer support, and we kind of talked about that last time, that being able to have your story validated does wonders, and when you retell your story and you retell it and you retell it, it becomes less traumatic when you are sitting with somebody who says, I believe you. I believe that you had this happen to you. It's huge.
So when it comes to the one particular part of this subject matter where of memories being completely blocked out of somebody's mind, why do so many people gravitate towards the paranormal? Why is that a natural reach to try to look into the paranormal as for an answer to what their lost time and that they can't remember? Is that them still searching for answers and not knowing, if they don't know enough about the physiological and psychological and all that kind of stuff? So if they're not really aware that it's a natural response of the human body to do that, then so they look elsewhere for the answer.
Because our brain is constantly telling stories. Our brain is a storytelling machine. That is what it does all day long. Everything we do, it is telling stories about it. But it only tells stories based on our own experiences and what we have gone through. So you have had experiences with Sasquatch. So when you see and have these things happen to you, you're able to relate it to that because that is your experience. If somebody has not ever had an experience with Sasquatch, their brain is going to try to make sense of it the only way that it knows how, based on previous experiences, which there's paranormal shows all the time, movies, all of it. Like, there's a lot of societal influence, again, that Bigfoot is not real, but ghosts, maybe. There's ghost hunter show, like all of that. Like, and if they're God-fearing, there could be a religious...
Poltergeist and demons.
Absolutely. So it's based on what your experience and what your knowledge is. And that's why I think it's so important to get more of this knowledge out there. So it's also, I think, important to note that the memory is still there. You may not remember it, but it is still encoded. It just, when we create a memory in a traumatic experience, it takes a different pathway than a typical memory would. So the only way to reactivate that memory and to actually recall it is it has to take that same pathway, which often means having to go through it again.
So what would you suggest to people who want to see a Bigfoot, who want to experience having something happen, but haven't had anything happen yet? What tools can they use to prepare themselves and to sharpen their mind to really be ready for it?
So breathing is huge. Breathing is a wonderful way to regulate our emotional state. So when we get anxious or stressed, and that's just kind of daily life, we tend to breathe pretty shallow, and our inhales tend to be longer than our exhales. So when we inhale, our heart rate and our blood pressure increase. But when we exhale, our heart rate and blood pressure decreases. So diaphragmatic breathing, where you inhale for 4 counts and you exhale for 8 counts, where if you can start lengthening that exhale, you can help move yourself from safety to emotion to prefrontal cortex. So in order to really create the best case scenario where you're able to pay attention to your surroundings and remember, breathe. So that's 1, 4, 8. There's also, and this one was discovered like in the 1930s, and it's a way that we actually will do this in our sleep when we need to get more oxygen. It's something that we do all the time and we just don't realize, but it really only takes doing it once to just bring yourself into your body. And it's a double inhale and an exhale. So it looks like this. So it's breathing in until you're pretty much full, and then
forcing a little bit more.
And what that does is it opens up all of these little nuggets in the bottom of your lungs that we don't often reach, and when we do that, that gets more oxygen.
AIOLA or whatever.
Yeah, the aioli. Yeah, not aioli. That's a sauce, but yeah. So the little axions and all of that in there. So it opens those up. So the other thing that happens with any sort of diaphragmatic breathing is we have the vagus nerve, and the vagus nerve runs from the back of our brainstem. It connects to our optic nerve, so our eyes, that all gets processed in the back of our head. It runs down our spine and it wraps around all of our organs. And the vagus nerve is what activates our parasympathetic nervous system, our relaxation and calming system. So when we breathe deep into our belly and we press down, our diaphragm expands, we're actually squishing that nerve, and it sends signals up to our brain to relax and to calm down. So that's why that exhale, I can feel all of that pressing. And if you're not used to breathing like this, I often will feel a little bit lightheaded. Just a little bit kind of like, whoa.
Almost like breathing helium.
Yeah, it brings you to a different state that we're often not used to functioning in.
Well, those are great tools. Those are great tools that people can have in their toolbox. And I'd like to throw this out there and see what your opinion of it is. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, I'm around a lot of people, and I'll ask them, when's the last time you read a book? And unfortunately, there's a lot of people who haven't read a book since they got out of high school. Reading a book is so rare for adults these days. For me, I'm such a voracious reader. I know you're a voracious reader. The ability to read a book and live 100 stories, 100 lifetimes by reading from cover to cover somebody else's story, does that improve the quality of how you can think by living through somebody else's story and training your brain? Because I'm not saying, I'm talking about a nonfiction book where, say, like a book about a person who's telling you this really happened. I was out hunting a bear and this traumatic experience, and so you can read and live through how they processed things and how they dealt with it. And can you get it through osmosis by reading?
So there's really no difference between somebody who reads fiction or nonfiction, because fiction is still stories.
Right.
So either way, what reading helps you do is develop empathy, right? There are certainly different connections that are made when we read versus when we watch something. But our brains are super visual, but also every person is different. So just because you and I enjoy and learn a lot from reading doesn't mean that somebody who doesn't read also isn't learning. They may learn in different ways.
Even though I've enjoyed reading, I've always looked at it as experiencing somebody else's life, that I can live their life, because I am the character in the book. When I'm reading the book, I am that character. So I'm living a life away from my own life when I'm reading a book. So it's almost like by osmosis, I get the experiences and the thought processes that they explain in those books too. And so that's why I ask, because I always, maybe that helps a little bit.
I feel that way about podcasts. I listen to probably 2 podcasts a day, and it's a lot of therapy related, psychology, so like all sorts of mental health type podcasts, hearing stories. But I've also, a lot of my work has been hearing people's stories and working through those stories with them. I think there's a lot to be said for having those different tools. I mean, because every person who goes through something is going to have a different skill set, and they're coming at it with their own experiences that are different from yours. And so absolutely, you're learning a lot.
All right. Well, I mean, I think we've been at this for 30 or 40 minutes. I'm going to want to wind this down unless there's anything else you want to say.
So I guess the only other thing I wanted to add with the learning and memory, something that's super interesting when it comes to cortisol and epinephrine being released. So when we experience something traumatic and our body sends out those hormones that then shut down parts of our brain, and we can have difficulty remembering, what's really interesting is that that's also a tool to use to increase learning and memory, but you want to implement the adrenaline and cortisol release after the learning. So instead of drinking coffee before you do something that you want to remember, drink the coffee right after you do the thing. So if I want to learn something, I'm going to read this article, I'm going to read this research paper, I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to drink coffee afterward. That adrenaline will help me remember the thing that I just did. But if I drank the coffee while I read it,
You'd be coming down.
I wouldn't be remembering it. I couldn't remember it as much.
Interesting.
So that's even something to think about when you're out having these
kind of modify your own behavior to very interesting. Well, I've learned a lot in this discussion. I appreciate Chelsea bringing her expertise out here for all of y'all to see. If any of you guys enjoy this, think it's interesting, and have any questions, I mean, is there any subject matter that involves the human brain when it comes to a Bigfoot encounter and the trauma involved? Throw the questions out there, because I'd like to have more discussions with her, but it may take some input from you guys. What have you experienced? And, would you be interested in talking about this, in depth? So.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you.